I read 162 books in 2024, and today I'm going to talk about the best of the best. Before that though, I do have some honourable mentions. So although they didn't make my favourites list, I still think that they deserve to be mentioned in some capacity. So I have 11 of them here. I'm just going to quickly run through those. So Without You There Is No Us by Suki Kim, The Heart of a Dog by Mikhail Bulgakov, No Country for Old Men by Cormac McCarthy, one I don't have, which is The Other Side of Night by Adam Hamdy, A Net for Small Fishes by Lucy Jago, The God of the Woods by Liz Moore, The Impusium by Olga Tokarczuk, The Reformatory by Tananarive Due, Down and Out in Paris and London by George Orwell, Taft by Ann Patchett, and finally Gilead by Marilyn Robinson. So they're just the honourable mentions that I wanted to mention, and now I'll talk about my favourite books I read in 2024. So my actual favourites that I read in 2024, I'm just looking at my notes. So I did actually make a video halfway through the year talking about my favourites that I had read up until that point. So I'm just going to briefly mention them here, but if you want to know more about them, you can obviously check out the other video that I have. Otherwise, this video will be like 2 hours long. So my favourites from the first half of the year were Jujutsu Kaisen Volume 1 by Gege Akutami. Then the rest I have here, I have Autobiography of a Face by Lucy Grealy, The Secret World of Farm Animals by Jeffrey Masson, The Book of the Unnamed Midwife by Meg Elison. I have another one, The Murderous Marriage by MC Beaton, which is in the Agatha Raisin series. The Husbands by Holly Gramazio. State of Wonder by Ann Patchett. My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrante. Run by Ann Patchett. And finally, Systemic, How Racism is Making Us Sick by Layal, Liverpool. So they are my favourites from January to like June, and I'm now going to talk about the rest of my favourites, so those that I haven't actually mentioned on the channel before. So first up is Orca, How We Came to Know and Love the Ocean's Greatest Predator by Jason M. Colby. This, as you can tell by the title, is about orcas. This is a very well thought out, engaging and well written non-fiction book about the history of the relationship between humans and orcas. Orcas are my favourite animal, and I do have a master's degree in marine biology, so I might be a tiny bit biased, but I really enjoyed this book. Enjoyed actually might not be the right word, because this was a very hard read at times, because obviously, as you can imagine, or maybe you can't imagine, maybe you don't know, so this is set primarily in the Pacific Northwest in America. So for a long time, but particularly up until the 1950s, orcas were considered to be pests, basically. Like, everyone hated them. They were being killed in the hundreds, if not thousands, by whalers, by fishermen, even by the US military. This all changed in 1965 when a local entrepreneur named Ted Griffin, he was the first person to swim and to perform with a live captive orca. And this obviously just changed everything in terms of the perception of orcas and also the history of captivity. So from about 1965 onwards, everyone ended up loving them. They ended up realizing how charismatic and playful and wonderful orcas are. But as they grew to understand and to love them, they began to realize the problems with keeping such intelligent creatures in captivity. So Jason Colby, he draws on articles, private archives, public records, his own family history, and he compiles what is, I consider, to be like the definitive history on orcas and the human relationship between them. Again, I might be very biased, but I really, really enjoyed this book. It is more scientific. He is actually, I think he is a lecturer, or he's a professor of environmental and international history. But compared to a lot of other non-fiction books that I've read that have to do with animals, this does have a much more scientific slant. But I love that. Other people might not enjoy it, but if this topic sounds interesting, I definitely think you should check it out, because, as I said, I love them. I love orcas, and this was a really, really interesting non-fiction book. The next book that I don't have is Why We Sleep, The New Science of Sleep and Dreams by Matthew Walker. This book was mind-blowing. Everyone that sleeps needs to read this book, because it really blew my mind. So obviously sleep is one of the most important aspects of our lives, of our health, and it's increasingly neglected in the 21st century. And it's been scientifically proven that neglecting sleep has devastating consequences. So the majority of the major diseases in the developed world, cancer, Alzheimer's, diabetes, have links to not getting enough sleep. And I'm someone who loves to sleep, like I prioritize my sleep, and yet when I was reading this book, like I was still terrified. Like it scared me. Like I needed to like even try harder to get enough sleep, because he really puts the fear of God into you about the long-term consequences of not getting enough sleep. Walker obviously did a lot of research to write this book. He talks about what sleep is, why we need sleep. He also talks about, again, as I mentioned, the long-term consequences of not getting enough sleep. He also talks about things that can affect your sleep, such as caffeine and technology and stuff like that. But if you are someone who doesn't get enough sleep, or that has a very inconsistent sleeping pattern, I think that you should read this book, because it might just change your life, because it kind of changed my life. It was really well written, engaging. This like one of the best non-fiction books that I've ever read. The next book that I don't have yet, and all the books that I've mentioned that I don't have, I will be getting copies of them because they were just amazing. The next book that I have is The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. This is a classic, and it was a very big surprise for me. I knew absolutely nothing about the story before going into it, so I feel like that's a good way to approach the story. But basically, it follows a man named Walter Hartwright, and he encounters this woman in white on this London night, and it kind of ends up changing the course of his life. Following on from that, he ends up being employed as a drawing master in this like English country house. And I don't think it's a spoiler to say that eventually these two plots like end up converging. It was a huge surprise for me, considering it was published in 1859. Like, that is mind-blowing to me, that a book published so long ago can still be read now and enjoyed. I really enjoyed it. The writing was great. I really ended up feeling for the characters. The plot was engaging. It's well over 600 pages, but it didn't feel like that to me. It was spooky, it was captivating. Yeah, I would highly recommend it, especially around like October time for those like spooky vibes, because I thought it was amazing. the next ones I have, I think, yeah, I have this one here. This is Death at SeaWorld, Shamu and the Dark Side of Killer Whales in Captivity by David Kirby. Again, connecting to Orca, this is about killer whales in captivity. I would actually really recommend reading these books kind of in tandem, like reading this book first, that kind of sets up the whole captivity industry, and then going into this one, which talks about SeaWorld in particular, which is an incredibly popular tourist attraction in America. David Kirby really created such like a scientific thriller with this non-fiction book. He really creates such a compelling argument for not keeping killer whales, orcas, in captivity. Like, even though like I didn't need to be convinced, but he really researched a lot. Like, this is quite a long book. He ends up interviewing people from all sides of the argument, including people that used to work for SeaWorld, people that still worked for SeaWorld at the time, scientists. He ends up interviewing a load of people. So this book that I haven't even said, this book centers on SeaWorld and the almost 20-year battle that was playing out between people who didn't think killer whales should be in captivity on one side, and then obviously SeaWorld on the other side. And it all comes to a head in 2010 when Dawn Brancow was unfortunately killed by one of the killer whales that was in captivity. This ended up obviously changing a lot in terms of people's perception and also in terms of SeaWorld themselves. This was really eye-opening, and if you've ever visited SeaWorld or any sort of wildlife park like SeaWorld, I would really recommend that you read this book, because I think it will change how you perceive animals in captivity, not just killer whales, but just all marine creatures. I really enjoyed it, and I'm not even going to say I recommend it, because obviously I recommend it because it's in this video. Another book that I don't have, that I forgot to mention, is Untypical: How the World Isn't Built for Autistic People and What We Should Do About It by Pete Wharmby. This, in my opinion, is a perfect book. It does exactly what it says on the tin. It describes what it's like to be autistic in the 21st century. I wish I could get everyone to read it. While I was reading it, it was like Pete Wharmby opened my brain and was just taking all my thoughts out and putting it onto a page. Like, I felt like he was writing this book specifically for me, which I know is not true, but that's how much I ended up connecting with this book. I would really, really recommend it. Again, I know I recommend every book in this video, but, you know, it was just a very important read for me. The last couple of books I do have in person, thankfully. So the next one, this is The Sound of a Wild Snail Eating by Elisabeth Tova Bailey. This is a delightful, short little non-fiction book about the author, Elisabeth Tova Bailey. She ended up getting a viral infection and developed a condition that none of the doctors could kind of figure out what was wrong with her. She was just bedridden for months and months and months, and her friend ended up giving her just a common woodland snail just to keep her company. So she was kind of like lying in her bed and just watching the snail that was living next to her. She could hear the snail eating, obviously name of the title, but it ended up being a really life-changing experience for her, because she ended up appreciating the slow way of life, the nocturnal way of life of the snail, because obviously she wasn't physically able to do what she had been able to do in the past. And by observing this little snail, she just realised, you know, that life doesn't have to be kind of go all the time, and you can just appreciate the small things. And this was a lovely, like, heartwarming little book that you can read like in one day. I really love this, and I love snails, so I think even if you don't love snails, you'll end up appreciating them after you read this. Next up is probably, like, there's two fiction books that are like my two favourite fiction books of the year, and they're so like neck and neck. One of them is Telephone by Percival Everett. This is my first book by Percival Everett, but it will definitely not be my last. This kind of blew my mind. I just really wasn't expecting to love this book as much as I did. So it follows this guy named Zach Wells. He is a geologist / paleobiologist. He works in the local like college as a lecturer, and one day he ends up finding out that his daughter has an incurable disease, which is obviously heartbreaking. At the same time, he ends up buying a jacket off eBay, and inside the pocket of the jacket he finds a note written in Spanish saying "help me," and the story kind of takes off from there. So it's, at one hand you have like a man and his wife grieving their daughter while she's still alive, and on the other hand you have this kind of thriller about like workers' rights in Mexico, and it's just, it goes places that you really wouldn't expect it to go. The writing was incredible. Percival Everett is a very experienced author, and I was really affected by this book. Like, I found it very emotional. I read it in like a 24-hour period. I just couldn't put it down. It was just so gripping, and yeah, I really love this book. One thing I find interesting is depending on the direction that the compass up here is pointing, there are 3 different versions of this book out in the world, and again, depending on the direction, there are 3 different endings to this book, which I think is really interesting, because I ended up loving the ending in this edition. So I know someone wrote an article comparing all 3 endings, so I really need to read that because I loved the ending that I had. So, and I wonder why Percival Everett, like, why he couldn't decide on one ending, why he had to have 3. I just find it so interesting, and I cannot wait to read more from him. The other fiction book that is kind of tied as like my #1 fiction book of the year is The Magician's Assistant by Ann Patchett. I've mentioned before, but Ann Patchett is my favourite author. I love her. This is about Sabine. So she is a magician's assistant. She has been for 20 years. The magician is her husband, and at the very beginning of the novel he dies really unexpectedly, and she's now like a widow. She's depressed. She just doesn't know what to do because she loved her husband so much. Like, he was kind of the reason for her to be alive in a weird way, despite the fact that he was actually gay. And they only ended up getting married recently enough from the start of the novel because he wanted her to be protected in the event of his death. So she was in love with him, but he was gay, and now she's depressed because he died, and she ends up learning a secret about this man that she thought she knew everything about. She ends up getting swept from California to the back arse of nowhere in Nebraska, of all places, and she ends up reconnecting with his family. I just love Ann Patchett. Like, I don't even know what to say. It's like, I find it way easier to talk about books that I hate compared to books that I love, because all I end up saying is that I love this, but I do. Her writing is just out of this world. The atmosphere that she creates in this book is just amazing. You can tell by the cover, but it's set during a really snowy time, and I think it does actually take place, well, a lot of it, she's in California, but once she gets to Nebraska, it takes place over a very short period of time. And just the way that Ann Patchett creates this world, and like her characters, I really don't know how she does it, because they just feel like real people. I just love these characters. I do. I just love these characters. I love the ending. I loved everything about this. And it's not even my favourite Ann Patchett, and I loved this book so much. It was heart-warming. It was life-affirming. It was just amazing. Read Ann Patchett. That's the takeaway from this video. The final book that I'm going to talk about is a book that I finished like really near the end of the year, so that's why I always like waiting until the end of the year before I talk about my favourites. And this is the last one. This is D by Michelle Faber. This is actually a middle grade book. So it follows a main character. Her name is Dikalo. She is from Somaliland. She is adopted. She lives with her adoptive parents in the small seaside town in England. And one day she wakes up and the letter D is after disappearing from the alphabet and from everyday language. She seems to be the only person that notices or cares that the letter D has disappeared. And this ends up prompting her, or she gets kind of roped into reconnecting with her old history teacher, and the story kind of takes off from there. It was really surprising how much I love this book. It has a really classic fairy tale, like classic fantasy vibes to it. Michelle Faber was obviously like inspired by Narnia and Alice in Wonderland, and it was actually written, I think it was written for the 150th anniversary of Charles Dickens' death. It does have a very Dickensian style to it, but I was shocked by how much I love this book. It has quite a low average rating on Goodreads, which I find really surprising, but yeah, I really enjoyed this. And I typically don't really like classic fairy tale vibes, but something about this just really got me. Maybe it was just the time of the year that I read it. So they are all the books that I read in 2024 that were my favourites. 2024 was actually the worst reading year I've had in a long time. Not in terms of quantity, obviously, but in terms of quality. I ended up reading a lot of really just meh books. At one point, I even thought that I'd fallen out of love with reading, like it was that bad. But still, I did end up reading a couple books that were really good, so it wasn't all bad. My goals for 2025 are to read most of, if not all, of the books that I own, and I also want to prioritize non-fiction a lot more in 2025. In 2024, non-fiction books only comprised about 15% of my overall reading, but 42% of my favourite books were non-fiction books, which I think is crazy. So obviously I need to be reading a lot more non-fiction, because that's just what I'm gravitating towards at the moment. So thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. In the comments, let me know what some of your favourite books were that you read in 2024, and hopefully I'll see you in the next video. Bye!